Thank you, Steve. It's a great pleasure to be here. Every year, it seems, I have this beautiful drive from Westchester to Great Barrington. And of course, many of you may have known or may have known Lowell Harris, who lives 2 houses up from me. And in fact, that's how I got involved with this AIER. Lowell Harris, a true gentleman and a scholar, and with a sense of humor also. The topic I was suggesting was growth prospects for the United States and the world economy. As we know what's going on these days, we know the economy is a major problem for us, so we hope not to go back into a crisis. But the topics, why still talk about the global financial crisis? Then I will examine growth prospects for the advanced countries and the G20. It's the advanced countries plus the most dynamic and large of the emerging markets. Also, why is the United States not growing very rapidly? Why is growth slow? We will define what slow is. Why is growth even slower in Europe and Japan? Can China be responsible for triggering a new global financial crisis? First, why still talk about the global financial crisis? Because it's not over, and we may fall back into it. So it's still a crucial topic to discuss. And there are many Cassandras saying that we are going back into a crisis, but some of these people, in all frankness, do not know what they are talking about. I'll give you one example. There is this person, Nouriel Roubini, who up to a few years ago, no one had ever heard of his name. Now he goes all over the world, having convinced people that he actually predicted the past crisis. So in front of 1,000 people, I said, Nouriel, you predicted nothing. And I don't say it to be nasty. We are here to understand. And if you predicted something that practically no one else predicted, we want to listen. If you predicted nothing, you just convinced people that you did, then you don't waste our time, okay? The point is this: in order to make a prediction, you must tell me when something happens and why. You cannot say we are going to have a crisis. As day follows night, we will always have crises. But you must tell me when and why, the reason, otherwise you predicted nothing. So in 2004, Nouriel, you predicted that a global financial crisis was imminent. In my dictionary, imminent doesn't mean today, but means soon, within a week, a month, 6 months, but soon. And the reason you said was that the dollar would collapse and cause a recession in the US and bring the rest of the world, which didn't happen. Then in 2006, you repeated that a global financial crisis was imminent. Again, this time because the price of primary commodities and primarily petroleum had shot up, which didn't happen. Then in 2007, you said the global financial crisis will begin in the housing market in the US, when we all knew. It's as if a week ago I had said here today, August 28th, it will be raining. Then 3 days ago, I would say it was cloudy. Last night, I look at the sky, see clear, and I make a perfect prediction. Today, sunny. So you predicted nothing. And again, I don't blame you for having convinced. I blame those who got convinced and pay you handsomely to listen to silly and wrong things. Now, in order to do useful economic analysis and forecasting, no one is a crystal ball. Nevertheless, doing forecasting, there are things that cannot be are not predictable. This is not a seismic area. California is. So we know there's going to be an earthquake, but nobody can tell when, even though we are trying to see how much the pressure is building, how quickly it can come, and how bad it can be. However, doing useful economic analysis and forecasting, even if it's wrong because of unforeseen, unforecasting reasons, it's useful, requires 3 things. Number 1, a deep knowledge of theory. Theory is like the GPS. Without theory, you have no direction. You do not know what to look for or how to discover what's going on. The second requirement is you need the knowledge of the real world, because very often the real world does not operate as theory dictates. And thirdly, you need a little common sense. Now, if you miss one of these, you will do economic analyses not only that are wrong, that are damaging, that are harmful, not useful. Now we have economists. Many of my colleagues, they think they are pure scientists. They are physicists. I'm an engineer, so I know what's and they don't know and do not want to know the real world. They don't want to dirty their hands with the real world. They want to do pure theory. But this is a social science. This is not physics. It's not chemistry. It's not a natural science. Okay? Then you have business economists who never knew the theory, or maybe they forgot the theory, and so they extend their charts without understanding why it should be extended the way, why the future should be the same as the past. And then you need a little common sense. And again, when one of these is missing, as in the case of Rubini, then you do not only wrong analysis, wrong forecasts, but actually harmful analysis and forecasts. I could say more. I mean, at one time, Trichet, with whom I was just 2 weeks ago in Europe, said in April and July 2011 that Europe would not go into recession, that Europe was big enough, autonomous enough, he had not heard interdependence, so that he increased interest rates, fearing inflation. Instead, Europe went back into recession. We didn't, Europe did. So you see how Greenspan, at one point, was ruminating, because Greenspan, when he talked to those old enough who remember, he could talk for 1 hour, and you would never know what was he saying. He was at one point, 10 years ago, proposing marriage. And the person on the other side of the table said to him, "Are you proposing?" After 1 hour of talking, she did not know what he was talking. But that's useful, because a governor of a central bank has to speak, but not too clearly. Otherwise, every time you speak too clearly, you create a problem. And so you want to, maybe that was... But Greenspan, in the year 2000, at the Economic Club, was ruminating, to what we could understand, that he was worried about a resurgence of inflation. When in fact, what was happening under his very eyes is that the United States was going into recession. So I said, Mr. Greenspan, you do not know what globalization is. Because if you understood what globalization is, you would realize that globalization is the most anti-inflationary policy the world has ever seen. You increase prices, you lose markets. You ask for wage increases in excess of productivity, the firm moves elsewhere and you lose your job. And notice the proof of this. It's not that we have forever resolved the problem of inflation, but notice when the price of primary commodities shot up in 2006, the price of petroleum $160 per barrel, not very much of a sign of inflation. So it's not that we have resolved forever the problem of inflation, but the problem is not inflation now. At the time, we were not growing, and we are not growing rapidly. Now, we know the causes for inflation, for the crisis that came. Savings and Loans Association banks gave loans to individuals and families at variable rates, when the variable rates were the lowest in 50 years, even to families and people who could not afford those mortgages. So they would fail. So why did these banks give these people these mortgages, knowing perfectly well that they would not be able to sustain the mortgage? Because the Savings and Loans Association sold those mortgages to investment banks. And investment banks acquired those dangerous mortgages because they would then repackage them with other securities and sell them all over the market. And by so doing, not only they would minimize the risk, that they would minimize the risk to the point that the danger disappeared. So that's securitization. And then why did individuals buy? business buy these instruments, these financial instruments or packages, because they had AAA ratings. And who gave these AAA ratings? The companies who are paid by the firms that they are supposed to rate. The rating agencies are paid by the companies they're supposed to rate. So if you don't give me AAA rating, I go to your competitor. And then the Security and Exchange Commission, and we saw Cox, the head of the Security and Exchange Commission, at a Senate testimony, completely incompetent, asleep at the wheel. So for all of these reasons, the crisis came. Now, Europe said, did you see, the United States, did you see what you caused us? You caused the crisis. And I said, well, wait a minute. Europe committed even more excesses than the United States. If they had not committed more excesses, the crisis would not have come as quickly and deeper than the United States. How do we measure excesses? Well, banks can make very dangerous business decisions, give loans which are very extremely risky. We have an index of this, which is the leverage. Okay? Leverage. Leverage is an index that goes from 0 to 100. When it's 0, there is no chance that the bank will fail. In fact, it's not a bank. It's a safe deposit box, so it doesn't lend, and insured. So there's no... The index of 100 surely will fail. And so when Lehman Brothers failed, the index of leverage was 31. Citicorp, the largest of the weak banks in the US, was 38. But Swiss UBS was 42, Deutsche Bank German was 56, and Barclays English was 63. Scottish was 63. So the average of the 12 largest banks in Europe committed even more excesses, more dangerous loans than the United States. That's one reason. The second is that what triggered was the housing bubble. Well, the housing bubble, if you see this line here, well, it doesn't show. It was supposed to show. This line here is the long-run trend in housing prices. This is 1997. If you start at 1 or 100 here, this is Ireland, housing prices. They shut up. This is England. They shut up even a great deal. This is Spain, and this the United States. So Europe committed even more excesses. Banks gave more dangerous loans, and the housing sector was, the bubble was even greater. And so Europe, the crisis came very quickly because it comes in the financial sector. The financial sector moves at the pressing of a key on the computer, on the keyboard. It occurred very quickly and deeper. And we see this here. So this is when the crisis came. Notice the reduction in GDP, the recession. This is the United States. This is Europe, and this is Japan. So when the crisis came, it was deeper in Europe and Japan than in the United States. Then in subsequent years, 2010 to 2015, growth resumed, and it was fairly steady, not very high, around 2%, 2.3% in the US. It came back in Europe, but then Europe went back into recession, and growth is much less than in the US. And Japan came roaring back in 2010, but then recession the following year, 2011, and growth is very contained. Those of you of a certain age may remember Japan was supposed to conquer the world 30 years ago. Since then, 6 recessions, and the slowest growth of any of the advanced large countries. Then the crisis came because the reason for doing this, some of this I have done last year, because what's happening now, it seems a repetition of what happened then. So what happened then is rich nations got into recession, the US, the Eurozone, and Japan, and so they began to import less from emerging markets and invest less. And because of that, the crisis spread also to emerging markets. This is the reduction in real GDP. At the peak of the recession, that is, or at the bottom of the recession, about 2% world GDP decline. This is the decline in world trade. So now, advanced countries went into a recession. They imported less, mostly from emerging markets. Emerging markets got into a crisis. And investment. These are the investments of advanced countries in emerging markets. It was 300 billion in 2006. It shot up in 2007, but then it went below what it was before. So importing less from advanced countries and investing less in emerging markets caused the crisis to come with a lag, because there is a real sector, does not move as quickly as the financial sector, spread to emerging markets. And this is what we have now. In India and China, the recession did not, the crisis was not reflected in a recession, negative values, negative growth, but a decline in growth. But in all the other countries, there was deep recession. So China went from 9, 10, 9% growth all the way down, and we will talk more extensively at the very end for China because it's a special case. Everyone now is an expert on China. I've been going to China since 1986 for 5 weeks a year. The leading text in managerial economics, international economics is, so I know something about China, and we'll have to say something. You see, in economics, we have to anticipate, not afterwards, you know. I mean, afterwards we all know what happened. But I started to say in 2005 that the growth rate in China would come down. And people didn't believe it, and it happened. And now I say that this growth rate is not 6%, as the government says, 7%, 6%. It is more like 4%. And we'll see why. And we will see, because eventually the truth will have to emerge. You know, it's like the internet. When people lie, things come up, and the lies will become evident. But know just one thing. So growth in China is declining, and we'll say more, but we are delighted with India. India was a hopeless case, it seemed. And now we are delighted. India grew when the monsoon came and were heavy, and when the monsoon did not come, India did not grow. Now it found a way to continuous rapid growth, and in fact, practically based on democracy, perhaps even more, and flexibility, perhaps even faster than China, even though India is coming from a lower base to begin with. Russia, of course, we understood it was never a brick in that sense of dynamic. It was based on the exports of raw materials, gas, petroleum, and so on. But look at Brazil. Brazil, 50 years ago, there was a chorus. The New York Times started, and The Economist. Look at Brazil, the size of the economy, the wealth of natural resources. And I said, we wish them well, but those things were there a century ago, were there 75 years ago, were there 50 years ago, were 25 years ago, and the world economic power is not growing at all, and this is not even recession. There is more, as capitalism indicates, than just government controlling the economy. But we will. So now the crisis came from advanced country to emerging markets. It came with a lag. Notice in 2010 it wasn't shown yet, but it started in 2011. But declining growth in the dynamic China and India, and recession in the other countries. And so this is the China growth declining, the US, the deep recession but coming, and Europe also deep recession and growing at half the rate of the United States. Now, for those who are not economists, don't worry about graphs. This is a social science. We have to understand what's going on. Now, we had a recession. Now, let's be fair. Many people attacked Obama for doing fiscal policy, very dramatically rapid or big fiscal policy. Anyone who was in government in a deep recession would have had to do that. Where he goes wrong is now, where he would like to continue to spend when we're not in a recession, but we'll come later. So what happens? We have two tools to overcome a recession or demand pull inflation. We have monetary policy and fiscal policy. What does monetary policy when you have a recession? These are the countries, and the rate of the interest rate, very high. When we realized we were in a recession, the interest rates were pulled almost down to zero. almost down to zero. Why? So that now, if banks charge very low rates of interest, then it will stimulate businesses to invest and restart growth and overcome the recession. So monetary policy was done to the extreme. The world has never seen zero, practically zero, 0.25, 0.15 nominal interest rates. But even though inflation is low, it is positive. So the real rate of interest is the nominal rate, which is practically zero, minus the rate of inflation, which is positive, even though it's small. So the real rate of interest is negative. In other words, you borrow $100 today, and you will repay maybe $101, which has a purchasing power less than $100 today. This stimulates risky investments. You know, if you pay nothing for interest rates, you pay back less purchasing power than you borrow, then you are likely to undertake even investments projects which are excessively risky, and so a new bubble may be emerging. That's one way the bubble can emerge. Since this did not work well, that is the most powerful traditional monetary policy, the government now came in with non-traditional policy by the Federal Reserve buying government bonds from banks and other bonds from corporations in order to inject liquidity into the system to lower rates, which are already very low, down even further to stimulate growth. It has done everything possible. You cannot do any more, and in fact this could be dangerous, because when growth resumes you can have rapid inflation. Now the central bank, or the Federal Reserve Bank, tells us, well, if growth restarts, we can mop up the excess reserves without, or liquidity, without causing inflation. Well, once it's more easily said than done. Once inflation starts, it becomes to gallop, and then you have to really apply the brakes and cause a recession to overcome. It's not as easy to do as the Fed recommends. But look at fiscal policy. I mean, we're all Keynesians. Keynes said, if you are in a recession, spend more than you take in taxes to stimulate the economy. But when the economy does well, you should retire that debt. Instead, we have deficits in good times and bad times. Now, Europe has a Maastricht criteria that says the deficit should not be more than 3%. Look at the United States. Of course, we don't have to deal with Maastricht criteria, but look at the budget deficit. The budget deficit, yes, is declining, but it is in excess of what Europe thinks is appropriate. And frankly, it's 5.3% of the... do you realize that if growth resumes and the interest rate increases, we have to pay the United States $100 billion more in interest on the national debt for each 1 percentage point that the interest rate increases? So we're riding high now, but we will, the chickens will come to hatch. So it's a problem. Look at the national debt. Look at the national debt. When Obama became president, it was 64% in the United States, the same more or less as Europe. Look at it now. Now Obama would like to continue to spend more. Krugman, Stiglitz, all the Nobels would want us to spend more. And the best way for non-economists or even economists to explain what's going on is as follows. A recession is like pneumonia. If you have a recession or you have pneumonia, you use antibiotics. We are not in a recession. We're just not growing rapidly. It's like a circulatory problem. And you cannot cure a circulatory problem or a structural problem with monetary and fiscal policy. And we've already done it to excess. I cannot understand how anyone can suggest that we should continue to spend to stimulate the economy when the problem lies elsewhere, as we will see. Elsewhere. These are structural problems. And you do not solve structural problems by monetary policy. Did everything possible to the excess, to extreme, and so did fiscal policy. What does he want, Obama, Krugman, to go back to 200% national debt? We don't want to become like Greece, okay? So this is, so we have now evidence So some people say that we are doing well. We're not doing well. And the proof is as follows. Now, this is what happened in the past. This is the tendency, the long-run trend of growth in the United States. Then you had a recession. So there was the GDP declined. But in all previous recessions, the 1 or 2 years after the recession, growth was extremely rapid to get us back on that long-run trend. All the time. You have a recession, GDP falls. You have a negative growth rate. But then after the recession, always in the post-war period, the rate of growth rose very rapidly to bring us back on that trend line. Now we lost this amount of GDP and the jobs. Yes, the growth rate is the same as the trend before, but we never recuperated what we lost. But we can see this even better this way. Notice, this is the growth rate, those lines, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years after the end of the recession. This is the Reagan recession. Look at the growth rate. Can you imagine the first year and the second year? It was 6-7% real growth rate. And then it went back down, but the average was about 4.5% over the 6 years. That was the Reagan recession. This is the recession 92-97. Notice the average is about 3.5% growth. This is the recession today, 6 years into the recession, and look at the growth rate. Less than 2.5%, between 1.5% and 2.5%. So we are not growing. We have a recession. They seem inevitable in a capitalist system, but in the past, we overcame the recession. This time, we overcame the recession, but growth was slower than ever before. Now, people say, but look at the rate of unemployment. Went from over 10% to 5.3%. So we're doing well. No, we're not doing well because 4 percentage points of the labor force left the labor force. In other words, you look for a job 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, you don't find it. You are no longer looking. When you are no longer looking, you are no longer unemployed. How nice, you know. I mean, it's so now 4 percentage points of the labor force left the labor force. These are people who not only could not find a job, they're so discouraged they're not looking anymore. This is bad. We should add those to the official rate of unemployment. We should, well, even before that, if we added those, we ended up that the rate of unemployment is not 5.3, 5.4%, the official rate. You say, well, we should. Yes, we should. These are people who would like to work and couldn't find work. They would be unemployed, except that they stopped looking. New York has a welfare system higher, stronger than Sweden. The New York Times, even the New York Times had to say that 2 days ago. But notice more bluntly, these are the number of people working in the United States in 2000 before the recession. Okay, the number of people working in the United States was 160 million jobs. For the recession, we lost 7 million jobs. After the recession is over, 6 years after the recession, we have the same number of people working today as we had in 2007. But during these 6 years, the labor force increased by 7 million. So we are 7 and now 5 million jobs less than we should. So we are not doing well. The rate of unemployment is low, but we are not doing well because people left the labor force. That doesn't make a country rich. If they don't work, they have to be on welfare. And we have the same number of jobs as we had in 2007, even though the labor force over that time grew by 5 million. We have 5 to 7 million fewer jobs than we need that we would have expected to have. And median household income, the median, of course, is the largest group in the economy. The family income was $57,000 a year on average. It went down to 52. Now it went up again, but we are poorer. American families are poorer today than they were in 2007. Now, why is growth then? So now, we were in a recession. The recovery was not as fast as we anticipated. We are not doing well. The question is why have we not doing well? First, productivity growth is slower than in the past. Look at it. These are the rates of productivity growth for each decade, and this is now the average per year for the 2010 to 2015. Remember, 2/3 to 3/4 of our increase in the standard of living is due to productivity increase. In other words, a worker produces 10% more, he or she can receive higher wages, higher income because of the increase in productivity. So when productivity goes down, the growth is so much lower, it creates less well-being, it creates less growth, less jobs, less income. And so now, why this is the case, that's another matter, another issue. We can deal another year that issue. But the second, the United States has the highest tax rate on foreign profits. Look at it. The United States charges a tax of 39.1% on foreign profits. Ireland charges 12.5%. So what happens? American corporations incorporate in Ireland or in England at 21%. And so they save billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in taxes. So we don't want to compete on taxation, but we want a level playing field, and we don't have. So now, if we reduce taxes on foreign corporate profits, hundreds of billions of dollars, we estimate how much, and they would come back to the United States, invested in the United States, which it does not. But this is what the left, you see, this is not a question of left or right. This is correct economics or wrong economics, okay? Someone said once on television in Europe, I said, economists of the left are a little, some little mechanism isn't working. Someone answered, the entire mechanism doesn't work, not just something. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. Why? They want to tax even more. It's self-defeating, okay? So now we are not growing because then outsourcing. Yes. Outsourcing provides us cheaper goods, but no jobs. Who created the iPad? The United States. How many iPads were built? Over 300 million. How many built in the United States? Not one. Where do they come from? All from China. I don't blame China, although China until a few years ago, 60% of the parts and components of the iPads shipped by China, exported by China, were built elsewhere from China. Now China is going upstream. It's only 30% of the parts and components of the iPad. But there is one thing which is wrong with American corporations. Do you realize where innovations come from? Innovations are not major explosions of things. They are cumulative, and they are done, and they arise in the process of producing. If you don't produce things, you lose the ability to innovate. So now, in order to save on production costs, we ship everything to China. I don't blame China. I blame our own corporation. They ship everything in order to save some of the production cost. Not realizing that this is a short-run benefit that kills us in the long run, because if we do not produce things, we will not be able to innovate. The next iPad will not come from the US, will come from China. So this is crazy. And you say, well, I have the leading text in the world in managerial economics, how to manage. And I'm not against globalization, but it has to be done. It has to be a two-way street. The United States imports from China $360 billion of goods and services last year, 2014. And exports to China, not even 150. Now, we know that you do not have to balance trade bilaterally. But when a country single-handedly is responsible for more than 40-50% of the trade deficit of the United States, something is wrong. Somebody is cheating. Somebody is doing the wrong things, protecting their own at our expense. But these are all the reason then. Also, economic uncertainty. Obama has never been in a business. Because if Obama were in a business, he would know that the worst thing you can do to a business is uncertainty. He's never been in it, so he does not know. Mitt Romney was in a business, okay, but he wasn't, okay? And he does not understand that uncertainty kills investments, and business don't invest. They do not know. And notice the health law. I have a nephew. He worked 40 hours a week with health insurance. 2 months ago, he was fired and rehired after a month. 3 people worked 40 hours a week. Now, 4 people were hired, the 3 plus 1, at 30 hours a week. Why? So the firm does not have to pay health insurance. I mean, people have to know that firms respond. Firms are not bad. Firm responds to incentives. And so the United States doesn't grow for all of these reasons, okay? We have a slow recovery. We've done everything we could, but we are not growing. And so we have to say that the United States has become a non-virtuous country. We are over borrowing. Monetary and fiscal policies have been pushed almost as far as possible. Structural problems keep U.S. growth slow by historical standards. That's the problem we have. We move on to Europe, and Europe has 2 problems. Sometimes they're mixed. You have the periphery of Europe, which is in trouble because they're overborrowed and non-competitive. And all of Europe has a problem of slow growth. We will see why. I mean, you see, sometimes people say you work all the time. But I have fun, not ridiculing. Reality often is funnier than the joke, okay? Reality is funnier than the joke, and I'll give you some examples of it. And so, for a person who works all the time, I'm not laughing at the world, I'm laughing with the world, but I'll give you some examples of it. So now, the peripheral countries, which is Ireland, but Ireland moved out, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Greece. When the euro came, the interest rates on borrowing became very low because the markets felt that with the euro, the common currency, a Greek bond was no more risky than a German bond. Then when the crisis came, we realized that a Greek bond, a Spanish, Italian bond is much more risky than a German bond. Interest rates went up. And so in the meantime, they had borrowed so much, it was sustainable when interest rates were low. Now interest rates shot up, and the same borrowing is no longer sustainable. But they also cannot compete. So I say that's not the problem. The real problem is that they cannot compete. If by miracle, and I don't believe in miracles, but if by miracle the excessive borrowing of these countries disappeared, they would still be in trouble. Why? The unit labor cost, a measure of competitiveness. If you gave an index of 100 to all the countries in the year 2000, this is the increase in unit labor cost and the loss of international competitiveness of the of the weak countries, and this is Germany. In other words, since the year 2000, and you want to laugh, do you know what a Greek train conductor earned in Greece in 2007? He's called a transportation engineer. He's a train conductor. You can call him whatever you want. He earned, or she earned, 120,000 euros a year. Tax-free, when the euro was $1.40. In other words, a train conductor in Greece earned almost $200,000 gross and $180,000 net of taxes. And the funnier thing is that the travel time to go to work and come back was part of the work time. In other words, you work 35 hours and you live 2 hours away, no problem. 2 hours to go to work, 2 hours to come back, you only have 3 hours a day to work. If you went to work on time, you got a bonus. If you washed your hands before going to work, you get a bonus. I mean, come on. I mean, this is who's going to check if you want? This is obscene. I've never. So now they want to retire at 57 with the son and get the same pension as the Germans who worked until 67. I mean, this is so. The point is, but Europe as a whole has a problem. If you take 100 as real GDP in 2004, you have the recession. Europe, the recession was deeper. The fall in the level, the economy size is deeper in Europe, and the growth rate picked up much more rapidly in the United States than in Europe. You say, well, the United States did not grow rapidly. In relation to what we expect, in relation to the past, Europe less. And this is per capita income, which is really the standard of living, or this is the United States, and Europe is in trouble. Why is Europe in trouble? Let Krugman answer. Why Europe is in trouble? Because they are over-regulated. They are over-regulated. These are how difficult it is to do business in Europe. The higher this bar, the more difficult it is to do business in Europe than in the UK and then in the US. If I tell you a truth, my colleague think it's a joke. In Europe, you have a corporation who signs a contract to provide a good or a service in 6 months and accepts to be paid in 9 months. This is the usual procedure. You know, it takes time to produce the good, and then you give 3 months to pay. The taxes on what they will get has to be paid up front. In other words, you will be paid in 9 months, something that you will provide in 6 months, and the tax on the money that you will receive in 9 months, you have to pay now. If the company that hired you goes out of business, that's your problem. The tax is not reimbursable. I mean, how laughable can we get? But there is another joke, which is, it's not a joke, it's reality. I reached once the European Commission in the year 2000, and I had another conference, so I reached late. But when I sat down, I heard something which is out of this world. I said, can the German and the French economists identify yourselves? They did. And I said, you know, I'd like to go to Broadway shows for merriment, for fun. But what I've heard here today, I don't have to go to a Broadway show. Why? Listen to this. I mean, it's unbelievable. They wanted to reduce the work week from 40 hours a week to 35 hours a week in order to create more jobs. In other words, the idea was if you have every 7 workers, that instead of working 40 hours, they will work 35 hours. Each one will work 5 hours less. 7 workers save, in a sense, 35 hours. You can create 1 extra job. In other words, even you have 7 workers working 40 hours a week, or you can have them work 35 hours a week and hire an extra worker. So I said, well, then why go from 40 hours to 35 hours? Why don't we go from 40 hours to 30 hours? We create even more jobs. Why don't we go from 40 hours to 25 hours? You see, if you work 25 hours a week, we have full employment. Something is wrong, my friend. Something is wrong. In other words, you don't have to be an economist. They were PhDs. What the hell did you study? What did you study? I mean, this. I'm not making fun. They deserve to be ridiculed because Germany and France passed a law. The law was to reduce the work week from 40 to 35 hours a week with a specific purpose stated to create more jobs. Well, then if going from 40 to 35 hours a week creates more jobs, going from 40 to 30 hours a week creates even more, going 40 to 25 hours, we have full employment. And what is the problem? So even non-economists can understand that. I mean, we wish it was so easy. We work 10 hours each and we have full employment. We'll have so much time for free. The problem is that implicitly they assumed that when you go from 40 hours a week to 35 hours a week, the weekly salary stays the same, which means that the wage rate increases. And in economics, we do not have the hypothesis of demand. We do not have the law, the theory of demand. We have the law of demand, that when the price of something increases, we use less of it. We increase the minimum wage. I'm not saying we should not increase it. But when we increase, the cost of labor rises, and businesses, what do? They substitute capital for labor. Some people who earn very little, their productivity is very little, and if you increase the wage, it doesn't pay for me to hire this person anymore. Now, this doesn't mean we should not increase minimum wages, but we should do what Sweden does. You increase the minimum wage, and then you retrain, and you induce people to retrain so that their productivity increases, and they can be rehired at the higher productivity. But that's not easy to do, but that's the way to do. So now, the world. We're coming. Yes, we're coming soon. The world is slowing down. The world is slowing down because innovations is slowing down all over the world. Also, the labor force in emerging markets is slowing down. You don't play God. You know, in China, you had one child, and now the next generation, you'll have in 2 generations, only old people. You have very little young people. Also, it's easy to start growing when you start from the very bottom. When you reach a certain level, there is such thing as a convergence hypothesis. When you start very low, you can copy things, you can move rapidly. You reach a certain level, and your rate of growth will slow down, and we can see the rate of growth slowing down. This is the world as a whole, and the bars indicate closer years. This is 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014. This is the world, this advanced economies, and these are emerging markets. World is slowing down. And this is the tendency over the estimated tendency. This is the growth rate of emerging markets. This is the world as a whole, and this is advanced countries. Notice the rapid decline. And finally, we have China. China rate of growth is falling. Now, but I've been saying this for 5 years. Now, in a month or so, some people say this is the rate of growth that China tells us, this is the real rate of growth. This is the rate of growth that the government tells us, this is the real rate of growth. Why did I say that? Do I have a crystal ball? No. The growth of the economy is a weighted average of the growth of each sector of the economy. When I looked at the growth of each sector of the economy, giving proper weight to larger sectors and so on, I came up with a growth rate of 4.5%. Not today, not last month, 4 years ago. Okay? And of course, I stand by the predictions. You know, if too many mistakes, and I change business. Okay? So this is, and this is, of course, is the stock market. But notice, a great deal has been made of the collapse in the stock market in China. Yes, but look where it was at the beginning of the year. So it is still higher than at the beginning of the year. So yes, I mean, it's but it may be that China, if China indeed is slowing at a growth rate of 4%, then they will demand less raw materials from the likes of Brazil and so on. They will demand fewer imports of other things, and can trigger the next world economic crisis. So it was, as long as it was growing, it was fine. Now it's not growing. So now what is the expectation? That the United States will continue to grow slowly unless we change our ways. We are becoming so regulated. For the first time in 40 years, I have to send to the federal government the attendance to my PhD micro class. You mean I'm not interested in people attending? The department is not interested, the students are interested. What is the federal government going to do? In other words, we are becoming over-regulated, and there's nothing worse that kills growth. We want to regulate appropriately and not over. But that's the end of my story. Thank you very much. So, any questions? Yes, sir.
You're talking about real and dirty. Can we talk about Monday morning, 9:30? Can you talk about the sudden 1,000 plus point drop in the imbalances that we experienced for over 45 minutes and shed any light on that?
Yeah, well, when perceptions change, you see, if you invent something and you get a benefit, an economic reward, how much benefit do you get today? It's the present discounted value, the present of expected future earnings. So now when there is a change in perception, the change in perception is discounted to the present and causes tremendous balances up and down. But it's a sign of instability, it's a sign, usually, even though the original bounce, there is up and down, eventually is an indication that we are trending downward. Okay, so uncertainty in the market is an indication that even when that volatility disappears, the economy is worse off than it was before. And so sometimes the markets exceed in both directions, but there is no question to my mind. Now everybody talks, but as I said, in economics, GM sold more automobiles in China than in the United States. Would have been important for GM to know last year that China's growth was going to be much less this year? Yes, because they would have not produced an extra million cars, which now they have to sell at a highly discounted price and so on. So that's why it's crucial to anticipate. As I said, no one is a crystal ball, but if they analyze things properly, many of the mistakes that have been made would not have been made, should not have been made. And we don't say it afterwards, we say it before. That's the difficulty. Yes, sir, and then we'll come back. Yes.
You mentioned the unemployment rate within the United States. And I've read numerous articles that talk about there are jobs in the United States, but the U.S. worker is not educated enough for that job. And therefore, Apple Computer is having everything made in China. What would you do to reform education in the country?
Yeah, well, this is, we know, this is a problem that we know, that education, first of all, is becoming so tremendously expensive. And frankly, I think we're going backwards. I mean, our high schools, up to the college level, we do worse than many other countries in the world. At the college level, we hold our own. And the only place where we do well at the graduate level, under specialization. Okay? And we do import a lot of workers from abroad, but companies also say that because it's convenient for them. Suppose they can find the worker in the United States, but they have to pay 3 times more. They will say they cannot find it. They cannot find it at the price that they pay the foreign workers abroad. That's the problem. But but we do need to reform the system because, as I said, at the lower level, high school and elementary school, we are doing a terrible job, and we hold our own in college and do only good at the graduate level. But then these people go back, and we are training our competitors. We don't want to not train them. We don't want. We want an open system. But to improve education, the quality of education is crucial. I went to City College. City College was called the Harvard of the proletariat. More Nobel Prize winners out of City College than any other college in the world. Then open admission came. We want to help. But what happened to City College? It went down, the reputation. You could not fail people. At one point, I was teaching at City College, and I was talking about the inverse of the slope. Someone from the end of the other side, a 4-letter word, said, I don't know what the slope is. Never mind the inverse of the slope, okay? So, and we're getting, but there is all sorts of studies that we need to improve. But there is something else. Firms say they cannot find. It's like you want to sell a house, says I cannot sell it. You cannot sell it at the price you want. But if you lower the price sufficiently, you'll sell it immediately if you lower the price. So they say they cannot find workers because they have to pay more. And it's how convenient it is to ship the whole research department to India. The whole research department. Okay? So on the one hand, there is a supply of better education. On the other hand, there is a demand part that firms play that game to minimize. But firms should look a bit forward. It's like teaching everything to everyone. We want an open economy. But if you teach everything, then they'll do it, they'll take away your jobs. And that's what, and it doesn't have to be regulated. The firm has to understand that if it stops producing something in our country, they will lose the ability to innovate. Look at the iPad. There was nothing new in the iPad. No technology was new. It was the idea to put them together, okay? Screens and so on. And the next iPad will probably come from somewhere else because we lose the ability. But that's an issue but there are many facets to it. Yes, sir.
Your description of all the things that are being done wrong is really encyclopedic, and I don't disagree with anything you said, but looking around the world, particularly developed economies, who do you think is getting it right, or at least wrong?
The United States, incredibly enough, is the one that gets it least wrong. Look at Germany. Supposedly, Germany does well. But Germany does well because there is a euro that was undervalued. If Germany did not have the euro, it would have the Deutschmark, it would be 40% higher, and 1/3 of German exports would be out of the market. Okay? So who lent money to Greece? The banks of the German banks and the French banks. Why did they lend money to Greece knowing that Greece would not pay back? Because they got high interest rates, and they knew that when Greece would fail, their government would bail them out. So the usual story, private profits and public losses. So one could say Germany, England does it. The UK also, I think, better than Germany but the UK is really the Greater London area. If you go past the Greater London area, you sometimes feel you're not in an advanced country. It's still two faucets, hot and cold. You know, you burn your hands, or you come from the fast train and you pass London and you go back to the slowness of a century ago. So, and notice, will England ever enter the euro? No. As long as London beats Frankfurt in finance, which is the major source of wealth for the UK, England has no reason to enter and will not enter. So Germany seems the best of the Europe, but it's not. It's the UK the best doing economically, and a great deal of the German. Look also when Putin invaded Crimea and so on. What did Germany do? Putin knew what he was doing. He's not a jerk. He seems like a jerk. He knows chess. He knows game theory. He knew that Germany would veto doing anything again, and they guessed right. He guessed right. Okay, so yes, sir.
What if by some miracle there was, over the last, let's say, 15 years, an obligation globally complied with that would keep currencies, rather than competitive undervaluation, within an equilibrium range, and the result on persistent and not current account imbalances, but actually, multilateral relative balance? How would you think this?
Yeah, the question is good, because let's put it this way. Suppose I'm more efficient than another country, and I can sell the same product at a lower price because I'm more efficient. But the other country has an undervalued exchange rate. Suppose I'm 10% more efficient, and that country has an undervalued exchange rate of 20%. Instead of me being able to export, rightly so, fairly so, I now have to import that good. So you can play games with the exchange rates, and what your suggestion is, why don't we keep the rate in equilibrium? First of all, it's very difficult to know what the equilibrium is. But independent of that, yes, the International Monetary Fund, its duty, its responsibility is to make sure that major countries do not play that game. And the IMF looked the other way. Today, China's currency is no longer undervalued, but for many years it was undervalued heavily. And the IMF looked elsewhere. Okay? And so now that's why. And so China said, I don't have an undervalued exchange rate. Well, there is a smoking gun. The smoking gun is that when you keep an undervalued exchange rate, you have an excessive, in quotation, but by any measure, excessive surplus, the counterbalance of which is the accumulation of reserves. So there is a smoking gun. If you did not have an undervalued exchange rate, you would not have an excessive surplus, exaggerated, unsustainable surplus, the counterbalance of which is the accumulation of reserves. When China entered the United Nations, can you imagine? The government of China asked all businesses, please turn over all the dollars that you have in order to pay for the delegation of China to the United Nations. We'll give you the yuans in exchange. You know, it's not free. And you know how much China was able to collect? $57,000. The whole country. Now they own almost $2 trillion in our dollars. How did they get that? By having an undervalued exchange rate, having excessive surpluses, the counterbalance of which was the accumulation of reserves. So Trump may be a little crazy in his ways of doing things, but he said, I don't believe this. We buy things from them, they take our jobs away, and we owe them trillions of dollars. Something is wrong, you know, something is wrong. Something is wrong, but now, you know, we don't want to blame, I don't blame China. China's playing the game. Look, you know, as the saying goes, you slap me once, shame on you. You slap me twice, shame on me for allowing you to slap me. Okay, so the point is, I don't blame China. It tries to do what's important for China. We allow it. Do you know that China has a deficit in the balance of payments with every country in the world? The only nation with which it has a surplus is the United States, and the surplus of trade that China has with the United States is more than all the deficits that China has with the rest of the world. Now, whose fault is this? Not only that, but there's more. I mean, I don't want to invade the topic of the Navy Secretary who came here 2 days ago. I know him well. We go to, but there is something wrong with when a nation steals 21 million of our files, and 4 million from the government. This is an act of aggression. You can do aggression in different ways. Now, I'm not saying we should start a war, but we take it looking the other way. And I don't blame China as much, although it's doing the wrong thing. We are allowing it. We allowed it. So our technology is being stolen left and right, and we know it. But
time for one more.
One more. Who will not sleep? Yes, sir.
If you had the power to change just one thing in U.S. economic policy, what would you do?
Oh, that's a difficult question. That is I mean, really, have someone up there who knows something about economics and business. And remember, I'm not here, there is not the other side to talk, but I always challenge them. Let's have a discussion. I mean, let's have an open discussion. Don't come and tell me that we have to borrow more. That we have to borrow more. We already have borrowed over 100% of our GDP. Okay? So, that's what, look, how did, you know why Romney lost? If I say one reason, he lost because he said something true. That 47% of the American people do not pay 1 penny in taxes and receive subsidies. And my wife, who's a woman of few words, said, how can anyone who understands economics ever win the presidency if more than 50% of the population believes that or is that? Reagan was not a very intelligent man, but he was intelligent enough to surround himself with intelligent people. And Reagan, with all the left to say, did two things which were incredible. Number one, he let the Soviet Union collapse without shooting one bullet. And how he did it? He said to Gorbachev, we have enough atomic weapons that we can destroy each other 1,000 times over. So we have to disarm a little. But you, Russia, disarm a little bit more than we. And Russia said, no, I'm a world power, military power like you. Either we disarm equally or we don't disarm. And Reagan said, no, you will disarm, because if you don't disarm, we will rearm and spend 5% more of our GDP on armaments. You know why? Because 5% of our GDP was equal to the total GDP of Russia. Can you imagine? Do you ever know this data? Did anybody ever told you that when the Berlin Wall came down, the total value of goods and services produced by Russia, 148 million people, was less than the total value of goods and services produced by the Netherlands, a country of 14 million people. They don't tell you this, okay? So someone who knows more economics, I think that would be, or intelligent enough to surround themselves. But because we hear crazy things, it's almost like economics turned into voodoo economics. Voodoo economics. I mean, we went from 64% of our national debt to over 100%. We don't have pneumonia, we don't have recession, we are not growing, and the reason is because we are over-regulating the economy. We are strangulating the economy. There's no oxygen in the economy, and more being added. Oh, we stop here. Thank you very much. Thank you.